The morning Miriam Lowe signed the papers, her father was in the back room with the door closed, and she could hear him breathing from the hallway. Not sleeping, just breathing. The way a person does when they're waiting for something to end. She didn't knock. She picked up the pen from the kitchen table, where it had been sitting since the night before, and she signed where the lawyer had marked with a small red X. Her name looked strange on the paper. Too neat. Like it belonged to someone who had made a careful decision. She hadn't made a careful decision. She'd made the only one left. 3 weeks earlier, a man named Cormac Steed had come to the door of the Lowe property on a Tuesday, which already felt wrong because nothing good had ever come on a Tuesday. He was tall in the way of men who worked outside, not the decorative kind of tall, but the kind that came from years of doing things that required height and strength and patience. He took off his hat when her father answered. That was the first thing she noticed. He took it off without being asked. Her father's name was Hadley Lowe, and he was 61 years old and owed money to more people than she had known about, until 6 months ago, when the letters had started coming. The drought had taken 2 seasons from them. The south pasture, which her grandfather had cleared by hand, was cracked like old pottery. They had sold the horses and then the truck, and then most of what was in the barn, and still the number had not gone down enough. Cormac Steed owned the parcel east of theirs. 800 acres of working land, cattle that were doing well, a house that had been rebuilt after the fire and was now more solid than anything the Lowes had. He had bought out their eastern fence line the previous autumn, which was how Hadley had kept them going through the winter. Miriam had not been there for that conversation. She'd been in Red Deer then, doing the second year of an agricultural program she had to leave when the money stopped. She came back in February. She had not planned on staying. When Cormac Steed came to the door that Tuesday, she was in the kitchen. She didn't hear what he said first. She heard her father's voice go flat in the particular way it did when he was trying not to show something, and she came to the doorway. Cormac looked at her. He didn't look away. Her father said, very quietly, "I'll need to speak with my daughter." Cormac put his hat back on, nodded once, and went to stand by the fence. He stood there without moving for 20 minutes while Miriam and her father sat at the kitchen table, and her father told her how bad things had actually gotten. She had known it was bad. She hadn't known it was this. The number her father said out loud made her stomach drop in a specific physical way, like a step she'd expected that wasn't there. She asked him twice to repeat it because she didn't believe it the first time or the second he repeated it. He was very still while he did. The way people get when they've been carrying something for so long that stillness is the only way they know how to hold it. Cormac Steed's proposal, as her father laid it out, was this. He would absorb the full debt. He would pay it directly. The land would remain in the Lowe name. Her father could stay. In exchange, Miriam would come to work as manager of the Steed household. And he was asking, her father paused here, in a way that was its own kind of answer. He was asking if she would agree to a marriage arrangement. Legal. Binding. 1 year minimum before either party could file for dissolution, and dissolution would come at no cost to the Lowes. He said he doesn't want you to feel trapped, her father said. Those were his words. Miriam looked out the window at the man standing by the fence. Is that what he said? He said you'd have your own room, your own decisions about how the house runs. He said it would be. He called it a working arrangement. She watched Cormac Steed not move by the fence. What does he get out of it, she said. Her father was quiet. Dad, a partner, he said. I think he's lonely, Miriam. I think he's been out there alone a long time and he thought, I don't know what he thought. He said it honestly. He said he didn't know how else to ask. She hadn't answered that day. She asked Cormac to come back Thursday, and he did, and she met him on the porch and asked him 4 questions. Whether he drank heavily, whether he had a temper, whether she'd have access to her own transportation, and whether she could leave if she needed to. He answered each one without flinching. No. Not generally, though he'd told her she should ask the people who worked for him. Yes, there was a truck she could use. And yes, she could leave whenever she needed, though he hoped she wouldn't, because the dissolution clause would take the debt protection with it. She said she needed another week. He said that was fine. She spent the week trying to find another way. She called a lawyer who was kind but not encouraging. She called her mother's sister in Ontario, who was not unkind but made it clear she had her own situation. She sat with the numbers every night until her eyes hurt, and the numbers didn't change. On the 7th day, she told her father she would do it. He cried, which she hadn't seen since her mother's funeral, and which she had not expected and could not look at directly. The Steed property was 12 minutes from her father's house by road, which turned out to matter more than she expected. Close enough that she could get there fast if she needed to, far enough that they were in a different world. The house was large and somewhat spare. Not empty, there were things in every room, books and tools, and the accumulated weight of a family that had been there for generations. But it was a house that had been managed rather than lived in. For a while now, she could see it in the kitchen, the way things were organized by function rather than by feel. The way the curtains were clean but never moved. She moved them the second morning. She pushed them back and let in the light. Cormac was in the yard when she did it. She saw him look up at the window. He looked back down at what he was doing without saying anything. The people who worked the land were 4 in number. A hand called Donnie, who had been with the Steeds for 11 years, 2 brothers named Price and Evan Tully, who did the fencing and the heavier work, and a woman called Marta, who came 3 days a week to help with the larger tasks. They were careful with Miriam at first, polite in the effortful way of people who have been told to be polite and aren't sure what to do with their hands. Donnie was the one who relaxed first. He found her in the tack room on her 4th day, taking inventory, and he stood in the doorway watching her for a moment and then said, "You know what you're looking at." "I grew up on this kind of land," she said. He nodded like something had been confirmed. She ate dinner with Cormac every evening. That had been his one request, stated plainly, that they share the evening meal. He said it kept him from working through the night, which was apparently a habit he had that wasn't good for him. She agreed because it seemed like a reasonable thing to agree to, and because she was trying, in those early weeks, to be fair. He was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something louder, probably. Something more insistent. He was quiet in a way that had weight to it, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of someone who had decided that words were for when they were needed. He asked her questions at dinner, real ones, not the surface kind. He asked what she had been studying before she left Red Deer, and when she told him, soil management, water retention in drought conditions, he listened with the kind of attention that made her feel, uncomfortably, that what she was saying mattered. She asked him questions too. She felt she owed him that. He had been born on this land. He'd gone east for a few years, worked in construction, came back when his father got sick, and found that he didn't want to leave again. He'd been running the property alone for 7 years. She asked if he had been close to his father, and he said, close enough that I still think about what he'd say, which she understood completely and didn't push. The evenings were the strangest part of the arrangement. Not difficult, exactly. Just strange. She was in a life she hadn't chosen, sitting across a table from a man she barely knew, and sometimes the conversation was easy, and sometimes they ran out of things to say, and he would refill her water glass without being asked, and both things were equally unnerving in their different ways. The trouble with Aldous Mercer started in the 5th week. Miriam was the one who found the letter, which was addressed to Cormac, but had been opened and set on the kitchen counter without comment. She read it because it was there, and it was open, and the word notice in the top line made something in her chest contract. Mercer was a land broker, as far as she could tell. He had been making offers on the Steed property for 2 years, according to what she gathered from the letter and from what Donnie told her haltingly when she asked. The offers had been refused. The letters kept coming. This particular letter was longer than a letter should need to be, and it contained a paragraph, near the bottom, that mentioned a zoning reclassification, and the phrase "at such time as circumstances make the current ownership arrangement untenable." She asked Cormac about it that evening. She set the letter on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. "He's been at it a while," he said. "What does he want the land for? Development. There's a push to bring a rail spur through this corridor. Mercer has been buying up parcels on both sides. He needs this property to make the route work, and you won't sell. I won't sell." She asked what untenable circumstances meant in the letter. Cormac was quiet for a moment. "There's been a question," he said carefully, "about whether I have the right to certain portions of the eastern boundary. The property that went to your father and back. There's a historical claim that Mercer's lawyer has been investigating. If they found a problem with the title, it would open things up. Have they found a problem? Not yet. But they're looking. They're always looking. She went to bed night turning the problem over in her mind the way she turned problems over, systematically, room by room. She had learned this from her grandfather, that a problem left unexamined in the dark grows larger than it is, but a problem you walk through carefully with a light is usually just a problem. By morning she had a list of questions. She set it on the table beside Cormac's coffee. He read through it without speaking. She watched his face. "You did this last night," he said. "I couldn't sleep. Some of these I don't know the answer to. Then we find someone who does." He looked up from the paper. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmly, exactly, not yet, but like a door that had been slightly ajar had opened an inch more. "All right," he said. The lawyer they found was a woman named Petra Vand, who was based in a town 40 minutes south, and who had the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who had seen most things and sorted them neatly. She went through the property documents with Miriam over 2 afternoons, because Cormac had to stay on the land, and Miriam had found she wanted to be useful in the way that used what she actually knew. She understood documents. She understood the logic of how land was held and transferred, the language of surveyors and title offices. It was the same language underneath as the agricultural work she'd been studying. Petra said, on the second afternoon, "You're quite thorough." "I have reasons," Miriam said. What they found was not a crisis. It was close to one, the way things are close to edges without going over. There was an inconsistency in a survey from 1987, a line that had been recorded 2 ways in 2 documents, and Mercer's lawyer had found it and was building a case around it. The case was not strong, Petra said. But it was not nothing. "There's a way to address this preemptively," Petra said. "A new survey, a corrected filing. It takes time, but it forecloses the question, how much time? 3 months conservatively. Less if we move now." Miriam drove back to the property in the late afternoon. The light was coming through the trees along the road in the particular way it did at that hour, long and amber and slightly sad. And she thought about the fact that this land had been in Cormac's family for 3 generations, and that a man in an office 40 minutes away with a real estate interest and a cooperative lawyer was trying to take it from him by finding a measuring error from 40 years ago. She was angry about that in a way that surprised her. She pulled into the yard, and Cormac was at the fence, which was where he seemed to go to think. She got out of the truck and walked over and told him what Petra had said. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Can it be fixed?" "Yes." "Then we fix it." "It'll cost something," she said. "The survey, the filing, Petra's hours. I know Cormac." He turned and looked at her. It was still strange, being in a position to use his name like that, saying it like it belonged in her mouth. "I have some money," she said. "Not a lot. Savings I kept when I left Red Deer. I want to put it toward this." He was very still. "This is your land," she said, because she needed to say it out loud. "You're not going to lose it to a survey error. Not while I'm—" She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "Not while I'm here" was what she had meant to say, but it sounded, once she had started saying it, like more than she had intended. Cormac said quietly, "I'm not taking your savings, Miriam. It's not a gift, it's an investment. This property is tied to my father's debt arrangement. That's a very practical thing to call it. I'm a practical person." He almost smiled. She saw it start at the corner of his mouth and then stop, like he'd caught himself. "I know you are," he said. And then he went back to looking at the fence, and she stood beside him for a moment before going inside, and she was bothered by the almost smile in a way she didn't examine too closely. The survey took 6 weeks, not 3 months. Petra was better than she'd said she was. During those 6 weeks, Miriam reorganized the supply ordering for the property, which had been done piecemeal and at too high a cost. She worked out an arrangement with a feed supplier 2 towns over that saved a significant amount, and Donnie said, one morning, with a kind of grudging admiration, "Where did you learn to do that?" And she said, "School," and he said, "You should have finished," and she said, "I know," and neither of them said anything more about it, but she thought about it the rest of the day. Marta brought her preserves at the end of the 5th week, jars she had made at home and carried out to the property specifically. Miriam received them without knowing quite what to say, and Marta, who was a direct woman without excess sentiment, said, "You've been good for this place," and left before Miriam could find a response. She mentioned it to Cormac at dinner. She didn't know why. She wasn't looking for anything. He said, "She's right. She's been here longer than I have. She'd know better than you. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean, he said. That's the one thing I know about her. Miriam looked at him across the table, this man who had structured a debt arrangement to look like a choice, who asked questions and refilled her glass, and stood by fences thinking, who had never once in 6 weeks pushed or demanded or made her feel that the paper she'd signed was something she now owed him the rest of herself for. You could have found someone else, she said, to manage the household. Yes. You could have hired it out. Yes, so why? She stopped. He waited. He did not fill the silence the way some people do, anxiously, with words that don't mean much. He just waited, she said. Why this arrangement specifically? Cormac set down his fork. He looked at the table for a moment and then at her. Because I am not good, he said, at building things from nothing, with people. I don't know how to walk up to someone and say, would you like to know me? I don't know how to do that. A pause. I thought if there was a reason, a framework, something that made sense on paper, then I could figure out the rest. Miriam was quiet for a moment. That, she said, is either the most practical thing I've ever heard or the saddest. Which is it? She looked at him for a moment. I haven't decided. He nodded, like that was a fair answer, and picked up his fork again. The corrected filing went through on a Friday in late September. Petra called to confirm, and Miriam sat on the porch in the afternoon light and felt the knot in her chest. The one she had been carrying since she first read the word notice on that letter, release itself slowly, like something coming untied. Cormac came out an hour later and sat in the other chair without asking. She told him it was done. He didn't say anything. He sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with things. Then he said, thank you. Petra did the work. You organized Petra. You organized most of it. She looked at the land in front of them. The evening was coming in from the east, the light going long and pale over the grass. The cattle were doing what cattle do, moving slowly, making the kind of sounds that are almost nothing and add up to something. My father called this morning, she said. How is he? Better. The south pasture, there's been some rain. She paused. He asked about you. He asked how you were. Cormac turned to look at her. I told him you were well, she said. I told him the property was in good shape. And she found she didn't have a way to summarize what the last 6 weeks had been, or the shape that was forming in her mind when she thought about the end of the one-year arrangement. She had come here afraid, and then careful, and then useful, and then something that didn't yet have a clean name. She had come here thinking she would mark time and go back, and instead she had spent her evenings finding out what someone thought about, what made them quiet, what made them almost smile. She had come here thinking she knew exactly what this was. He asked if I was doing all right, she said. What did you tell him? She thought about the survey and the letters and the window with the curtains pushed back. About Marta's preserves and Donnie's grudging nod, and the evening meals that had become, without her deciding anything, the part of the day she thought about earliest. About the man beside her who had built a framework on paper because he didn't know any other way to begin. I told him I was, she said. Cormac looked back at the land. The cattle moved. The light went lower. She hadn't answered the question she'd been carrying. The one about what happened at the end of a year, about what she would sign next, about whether a framework on paper could hold something that had already grown past its edges. She hadn't answered it yet, but she was starting, very quietly, to think she might want to.